It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. What is the relationship between gender and poverty? Most studies of poverty focus on the level of the household and tend not to pay much attention to the gender differences within a given household, which makes it rather difficult to find out how poverty and gender differences are connected or related. A recent study published by the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, looks at the way gender affects the poverty gap in Turkey. The study is titled A Multidimensional Approach to Gender Gap in Poverty, an Application for Turkey. Although the Turkish government claims to prioritize the closing of gender gaps, Turkish women argue that inequality in Turkey is enshrined in law, which makes it impossible to actually achieve equality. In a demonstration in 2017, several women sharply criticized gender discrimination in Turkish law.
They do not even let this happen. They cannot even tolerate this. They do not want us, the women, to be free. But we will not leave the streets as long as we can.
First, the government needs to stop their discriminative policies, even supported by laws, against women, because women will always say no to this.
The PERI study on gender and poverty in Turkey developed an innovative way of measuring the poverty gap within households so that the inequality between men and women in the same household can be revealed. It uses a Turkish survey of living conditions for the years 2006 to 2015 and a multidimensional poverty measurement method that takes education, health, employment, and household living conditions into account. We're now joined by the two authors of the PERI study, Hasan Tekguc and Bengi Akbulut. Both of them earned a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Hasan joins us from Istanbul, Turkey, and Bengi joins us from Montreal, Canada. Thanks, Hasan and Bengi, for being here today.
Sure.
Thank you for inviting. Yeah.
So, Bengi, let's start with you. Explain what it means when you found that the gender poverty gap difference within households was 8%. How can there even be a poverty difference within one household? And what are the consequences of this for men and women and for poverty?
So as you mentioned in the introduction, normally when we look at poverty measures, they're calculated at the household level, which means that everyone who's living in the household is treated as if they're affected by many of the processes outside of the household in the same way. What we've done in this study is to look at individual status as much as we can. So in our measure, we have health and education, as you mentioned, and employment as dimensions of poverty. Excuse me. So what we've done is we've looked at individuals in the household and looked at their health and education and employment statuses. So we have a number of variables that proxy for health, education, and employment status for different individuals, whereas they mostly share the same household conditions. So the living conditions, how good a quality the household is or the infrastructure is mostly the same, which is not really true, but we've treated them as if they're more or less the same for women and men in the same household, whereas their health status or education or employment status might be different, which means that women and men who live in the same household might be facing very different health conditions or might be having very different educational attainments or might have very different employment statuses, which all contribute to their poverty status.
Hasan, tell us more about the multidimensional measurement of the poverty gap. I mean, how is it different or better from other measurements of poverty, such as the Human Development Index or the Millennium Development Goals?
Okay. Actually, the multidimensional poverty measurement is built upon the Human Development Index idea, and its main difference is the measurement is not the national averages, but at each whatever you want to dimension you want to measure, you measure it individually. So its advantages come from the fact that you can identify households who are deprived in more than one dimension, whereas in an Human Development Index approach, you only know the country averages for each dimension. So a country that has some people poor but not healthy, some people educationally deprived but healthy, and some other people who are unhealthy but educationally completed schooling will have the same score, whereas with another country where the same individuals are both educationally and health-wise deprived. So the multidimensional poverty approach takes the Human Development Index and apply it to the individual level so that we can identify households which are jointly deprived in more than one dimension. This is, so we can really see if it is households that are deprived in a very severely versus only in one dimension or maybe two dimensions only, depending on your choice of dimensions. Yes.
Now, Bengi, turning back to you, looking at the survey of living conditions for 2006 to 2015, how do you assess the trend in terms of the gender inequality and regarding the poverty gap? Is this poverty gap closing at all?
Well, okay, since we're kind of limited by the data set that we use, we see some trends of shrinking gender poverty gap, looking at that data. Mostly, we saw that especially young women are kind of driving this shrink in the poverty gap because, as I mentioned, and as Hasan mentioned as well, education is one of the core aspects or dimensions of poverty that we have included. So younger women are facing or attaining faster increases in educational status. So that's one of the dimensions that really are driving the shrink in the gender poverty gap that we witness. The other one is, though not as significantly, is driven by the employment status. So the more that women are able to get opportunities in the formal labor force or are able to stay in the formal labor force longer, that drives partly the shrinking in the gender poverty gap as well. That said, there's one dimension or there's one aspect of it that we should that is kind of a limiting aspect of our analysis is that as we do not have how household conditions are affecting or how household conditions are enjoyed by household members, men and women, separately, we do not really see if there is a change in the gender poverty gap in that sense. So we kind of assume that everyone who lives in the same house are able to enjoy the living conditions or they have the same living conditions, which might not be true. So we are not able to see that change if there is any, but in terms of education and especially employment, we see some changes in the gap in gender poverty.
Now, Hasan, and Bengi was talking about how you found that labor force participation being one of the main forces in reducing the poverty gap for women. Now, and that reducing these gaps were mainly made for young women, it seems. So isn't this a positive development since it gives hope that advances towards gender equality are sustainable over the long term?
Very limited hope because it's moving very slowly. So we are speaking here like a reduction in gap of maybe 5 to 6% between men and women over 10 years. So this is very gradual. And some of it is that women's labor force participation in Turkey, the starting point is very low. So we are, what we are seeing is, so in our data sets, around 30%. So it's like, we don't know if this trend is going to all the way to close the gap. So I can't say if this progress will continue when the female labor force participation reaches to 50%, if it ever reaches. So it's important to realize that it's a very slow and improvement, and we don't have a range of data that's like can give us an idea of what will happen when we are like the women are really close to men, because that's just never happened in Turkey in labor force participation. So it's out of our observation range. But my guess, this is not something we've explicitly investigated or can investigate, but the increasing employment of women is driven by an increasing educational attainment, and the educational attainment for younger generation between men and women is already the gap mostly closed. So if the driver is in employment is the education gaps closing, and it's almost closed, so what else is going to drive it in the future? I think my guess would be policy, which relates back to your initial the video from Turkey. So that's up for grabs.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Hasan Tekguc and Bengi Akbulut, authors of the Perry Report, A Multidimensional Approach to the Gender Gap in Poverty, an application for Turkey. Thank you for joining the Real News Network.